I'm very pleased to be here today to actually talk to you a little bit about the very first unveiling of the District of North Van's Climate Adaptation Strategy. And before I get going, I want to just recognize something that Bob mentioned, and I know Ted talks about all the time, is the importance of not just water, but water and soil. So I'm quite excited to hear that because I've been known throughout my jurisdiction as the dirt devil. So I can actually bring some credence now to my propensity for talking to people about dirt. The other thing I want to talk about is Kim talked and showed a little bit about this shifting baseline syndrome slide. And as someone who's been working in the same municipality for well over 20 years now, I can't tell yourselves and others how important it is that we recognize this and we begin, each of us, taking steps and measures to avoid this shifting baseline. One of the ways in which I've tried to work on this is I coach high school sports, and in particular I like coaching high school basketball. Last night our team had our first game of the season and we were traveling to a school. It was quite a big game for this school, and we were down 2 points with under 30 seconds to go, and one of our kids hit a three-pointer to bring us up by one. They came down, took the ball, drove to the lane, through the lane, we fouled and put this kid on the line, and he made one shot, missed the second one. We collected the rebound and ran the game out, and I watched these boys, and to these boys this was their entire life that just appeared in literally 30 seconds. And while the kids were celebrating on the floor, literally off the bench, congratulating their teammate who collected this rebound, I'm actually thinking about today and what I was actually here today to do. So as a result of that, I've decided that as the boys at practice tomorrow will be running their suicides, I'm going to be talking to them a little bit about water. It's another reason why I've chosen to affiliate myself with programs that are really working with the young professionals coming through the water network, places like UBC's Land and Water Systems Master's Program, a new innovative program that is bringing new young professionals into the world of water and land and soil. This is how I think we can all help work on this shifting baseline. So with that, I'm going to get into the District of North Vancouver's Climate Change Adaptation Strategy. Our strategy, which is based on all of our climate change research and information and data supplied by important regional governments like the one represented by Keith who just talked. The regional government has provided us with a lot of data and a lot of modeling information. We know there's going to be impacts to the North Shore. One of the things we've already realized and we're having to deal with are the results of dramatically changing weather. For example, last August, we had an out-of-range windstorm that hit our community, resulting in significant catastrophic damage to every asset of our community, infrastructure, people's lives, and the environment. And we talked a lot about the inconveniences caused by loss of power and things like that, but Bob talks about the importance of restoring ecosystem services, because in the end it's what we all rely on, right? That windstorm took out hundreds of square meters of 100-year-old cottonwood forest that is just not going to regenerate overnight or over a short period of time. It was a significant impact to us. Changes to our climate are going to happen in many, many different ways. So part of our climate change adaptation strategy that we've begun to work on was to look at the impacts that our community is going to experience and come to not only recognize but acknowledge and plan for the fact that our community is vulnerable. We've known that, we've seen it, and we're going to prove through a strategy of how we're going to help fix that. Emergency and response services were taxed to the limit during that windstorm and the flood event that I showed you. This is a very, very big issue for local governments who must fund their entire rescue and emergency services strategy. This was a very, very big thing for us financially in terms of our inability to manage events like this on any kind of frequency. We cannot do it. We must plan now to minimize and reduce the effects of these kinds of climate change events. Schools were affected. The flood I showed you of Kilmer Road actually flooded the high school at Argyle, where I happen to coach basketball, and caused the school to be shut down for a period of time. So these kinds of events are going to affect our community significantly. One of the other important facets that we don't talk a lot about is infrastructure and important community services. This picture shows Lower McKay Creek right next to the main CN rail line that comes through our community. This is the same CN rail line that hauls chlorine, it hauls heavy metals, and it hauls other important commodities in and out of our community. But the picture just shows how vulnerable we are to service disruption and other related catastrophic events associated with climate change. We barely dodged a significant event with this debris jam down at McKay Creek just above this crossing. We talk about effects to the environment. Well, climate change is having effects on our environment that we're seeing every day. Loss of plant life, and importantly in North Van, we're seeing significant impacts to our watersheds and our rainwater management assets, which are our streams that come through our community. So what can we do? We have chosen to follow a framework model to help us through this climate adaptation strategy. The model has shown that we have two ways to actually respond to climate change. We can mitigate and we can adapt. And so focusing on our strategies, having a framework has helped us look at different ideas around mitigation, adaptation. Mitigation, we plan, implement activities that actually help us reduce greenhouse gases and the cause of climate change. Adaptation is how we change and build our communities to be more resilient to the inevitable changes associated with climate change. But one of the interesting things that we found is that when we look at the two strategies separately, we begin to find strategies that anyone can implement that actually do both things for us. For an example, as a strategy that will both mitigate and help us adapt is urban afforestation, the use of trees and the soil they grow in to help us adapt, but also to mitigate climate change. Trees help us with greenhouse gas emissions, but they also help us with ecosystem services, rainwater management services that trees and soils provide. So right away, it's helping us identify and plan and devise policy around directions we want to go to help us adapt and mitigate. Adaptation is not new to the District of North Van. We have been adapting and mitigating for some time now. We have done a comprehensive district-wide assessment in terms of risks associated with natural hazards. In fact, I think we're one of the leading municipalities in the country, if not the world, in terms of quantitative risk assessments around natural hazards. We put in place development permit areas around managing natural hazards and environmental protection. We have developed standards for our buildings and infrastructure and have included a development permit area designed to make every new building in our commercial and industrial zones meet certain standards in regards to energy efficiency, thereby helping with climate change. One of the things, Glenn, you'll be happy to know is we have now almost successfully successfully revisited our entire asset inventory in terms of not just a 2 and 3 year cycle, but a 40 and 50 year long-term outlet to look at our assets, what are they doing for us now, and preparing and planning for them properly in terms of the life cycle approach. Like I said, we are using an adaptation strategy developed around our OCP. Some of the strategies or some of the ideas or chapters that I just mentioned all revolve around our community plan. And you can see them here in the wheel. For a local government, everything we do is driven by our official community plan. So by linking our climate adaptation strategies to the official community plan, we provide this common link and enabling actions and enabling discussions around when we come time to talk about transportation, asset management, climate change adaptation. It's all linked to our community plan. So one of the first steps we did is we identify our policy and our program gaps. We look at ways we can support and inform our other long-term programs in terms of climate change adaptation. And in fact, our climate change adaptation strategy is now being found to be one of the key foundation blocks to successfully implementing our official community plan. After we got into it now, we found that our adaptation strategy is actually going to allow us to better coordinate all of our day-to-day type of work. We'll identify synergies between policies, programs, and projects that were otherwise non-existent. We feel quite confident that our strategy is going to help us reduce costs when we think long-term. Applying our climate change adaptation strategy is going to actually help us achieve the maximum benefit we can out of different kinds of strategies that we put in place. We've chosen to follow a best practices guide, which is a program that's been put out by ICLEI, and the program that we're using is called BARC, B-A-R-C, standing for Building Adaptive and Resilient Communities. And it's a framework that has allowed us to go down a road that we hadn't gone down before. We've never built a climate change strategy. So we were quite pleased to find this available framework, to follow it, and go through this step-by-step process. The BARC program is a 5-step process. The first step is we initiate our adaptation planning. We then identify priority climate change impacts, and I'll go into some more detail. We then create our climate change strategy. We implement the strategy, and then we monitor and review the results. So in terms of initiating the planning process, Keith talked about the importance of your team. So this is our internal team, and this is just the district team that we use to engage everyone in our community around climate change and the impacts to them. Emergency services, engineering, planning, emergency natural risk management, and environment and sustainability. We brought an entire integrated team together just to initiate this process and going out to our stakeholders. The stakeholders list was exhausted, but we wanted to hear from everyone. We worked with PKIC on what is the latest climate data that we can use and we can find, and we began to build our planning and our strategy. So the next step in what we did is we started to look at and identify the impacts that our community might feel during or as a result of climate change. What we did is we looked at climate change, impacts to the district, and then we did a risk assessment on each one. And the result were our own separate and unique list of priority climate change impacts. So A little bit about the risk assessment. What we did is we looked at and we asked all of our stakeholders, what would be the climate change impacts to you and your service, your function, by the different types of climatic change that we had projected to affect the North Van District. So out of that, the second step was to do a risk assessment on each of these, i.e., what was the impact? What is the likelihood of that impact occurring? And then, what were the consequences? And that is the framework we use to prioritize our list of actions. We used 5 consequence categories in our matrix for a risk assessment. Public health and safety was the first one. Local economy and growth. Community and lifestyle. Environment and sustainability. And public administration and governance. So these were the categories that we looked at, the individual impacts, for example, flooding. We then looked at the likelihood or the statistical probability of flooding occurring. And then we looked at the risks and consequences of that happening, and then we put them into these categories. So here's an example of the outcomes of certain events occurring. For example, I talked about windstorms. So our stakeholder consultations identified personal injury, structural damage, damage to street and urban trees, delayed delivery of important municipal services. Those were the consequences of windstorms. We then look at the probability, and then we begin to build our priority matrix. This is a look at, again, the risk assessment. Oh, sorry. So up here, I talked a little bit about probability, and this is all using the Zickley framework. So the likelihood of an event occurring using these 5 different categories. Then in terms of the consequences, there's the 5 categories that we had just talked about. We rated the consequences on a scale of negligible through to catastrophic. And then to prioritize our list, we ended up with risk is the likelihood or the probability of something happening times these consequences. And then we get this scale along the bottom. So we were able to use this framework and plug everything that all of our stakeholders have come up with into this matrix that we then now forms the basis for our actual implementation. So, as an example, we look at our high risk climate change events to North Van District. Wildfires, imagine that. In a local government that receives almost 3,000 millimeters of rain a year, wildfire came out of this matrix as one of our highest risk climate change events to plan around. And when we thought about it, we could understand why this was the case, because while the likelihood of a wildfire occurring was relatively or comparatively low, the consequences were significant. The consequences were significant across all 5 of those categories. A significant wildfire would prevent us from delivering service. A lot of our water infrastructure, in terms of emergency, is in reservoirs stored at the highest elevation in our community, right where a wildfire is most likely to occur. So we begin to plan and devise strategies around protecting our water resource for emergency by implementing wildfire protection, silviculture prescriptions around all of our water service infrastructure for emergency. We found droughts, heat waves, invasive species, other things were low risk. based on the framework that I just spoke about, these lower risk activities or lower risk situations then become lower down our scale of actually planning action around. So now, we've initiated it, we've done our research, we are now getting ready to put our plan together. That's taking all of our priorities and starting to meet in an integrated team fashion and plan how are we going to reduce our consequences associated with the high-risk activities that we've done. Some of the things we're already doing, for example, I mentioned development permit areas. We're one of the few local governments in the Lower Mainland region that actually has a wildfire protection development permit area. So that is an actual set of standards that apply to every new home that is constructed that's within our wildfire development permit area. So that's an example of a strategy that comes out to help with your climate change adaptation plans. So what I'm presenting here is really not much of my work, but a lot of the district's work. The team that actually put the project together, this is our actual staff person responsible for natural hazards management in the district. We have a specific person whose role it is to work on natural hazards. Julie here works with me, and her role is sustainability, environmental protection. And we were fortunate to find Sinead, a soon-to-be a master's graduate student, who coordinated the first two phases of our project. Those of you really interested in working towards climate adaptation and strategies, Sinead is going to be defending her thesis momentarily, and then she's looking probably for work. So I believe I've just given you all a reference letter. Very sharp young lady, this girl.
Thank you, Richard.